Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us at today's event. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that wherever we are in Australia, we are on the traditional lands of First Nations people. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands the UTS City campus now stands, and also from home where I'm joining from today. I pay respect to the elders past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land and their ongoing connection to country and culture. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country where you are joining us from and pay respect to their elders. So, hello, or in my best Gadigal, Budyeri Kamaru. My name's Simon Darcy. I'm a professor in the management department at UTS Business School and the co-lead of the UTS Disability Research Network, which this event is being auspiced by today. It's my pleasure to be welcoming you all to today's conversation on entrepreneurs with disability, policy and organisational considerations. I'm delighted to be joined by a distinguished panel of speakers from our industry partners, Dina Petrakis from Settlement Services International and the IgniteAbility Program, and Paul Musso stepping in for Kerry Langford from National Disability Services today, who is dealing with some serious issues with the lockdown and disability service provision, and we wish her the best. First, some housekeeping. Today's event is being live captioned. To view the captions, click on the CC Close Caption button at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom control panel. We are posting a link in the chat now, which will open captions in a separate internet window if you prefer. If you have any questions during today's event, please type them into the Q&A box, which you can also find in your Zoom control panel. You can also go in there and like other people's questions. We will have time to put some of your questions to our panelists. I would now like to welcome our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Attila Brungs, to say a few words to launch our second report on entrepreneurship in Australia. Attila.
Thank you kindly, Simon. And a very warm welcome, I'll just add to Simon's welcome, a very warm welcome to all of you joining us here today. Thank you very much. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, and not just for their ownership of the land, but as traditional custodians of knowledge for these places. And at UTS, we believe that knowledge is at the heart of our university, and it needs to be at the heart of all of our approaches to support society. I've said this time and time again, so the UTS people are probably bored, but we are a public institution, and that means we exist solely for public good. That's the only reason universities exist. And it's not just for those who pass through our doors, not just for the students we work with, but for those all around us, those connected with us, for all society. Now, again, that's easy to say, but much harder to do. And that's a real focus at UTS. How do we make sure that that aspiration is a reality? And we do that in many ways, through the development of our incredible students who go out and shape the world around us for positive, through our partnerships with the community around us, such as today's, through our research, and importantly, the use of knowledge with our partners to solve either specific issues, to lead critical discussions or debate in society, and solve particularly, I think, intractable or wicked problems. As you can probably hear my voice, I'm incredibly proud to introduce the work of our business school researchers and partners who in this path-breaking first national study of disability entrepreneurs across Australia have uncovered findings in this area where research is scant and which can make a real significant positive change. This report highlights the importance in general of evidence-led policy, not just all over the places in general, but particularly in disability employment and the self-employment space, as we understand employment is a key area of disability citizenship. Now at UTS, we support a culture of inclusion, and we are committed to removing the systemic barriers that prevent full and equitable participation and representation of all people across academia, our workforce and our students. But we know that disability is part of the diversity of human experience, with nearly 1 in 5 Australians having some form of disability. But when it comes to employment of people with disability, Australia unfortunately ranks poorly behind many nations, particularly the OECD nations, 21 out of 29. And this is one of the reasons why evidence-led policy to promote inclusive outcomes in disability employment is so absolutely critical. Such an understanding will support Australia's capacity for developing evidence-based policy initiatives to increase the numbers and particularly the success of entrepreneurs with disability. This report highlighted some hard truths that as education providers, we must pay particular attention to. People with disabilities are twice as likely to be unemployed than those without a disability and twice as likely to be living in poverty. Labour force participation has constantly only been around 50%, much lower at 25% for anyone with higher levels of support than other recipients of the NDIS. And entrepreneurs with a disability do not have the same access to the forms of support that mainstream programs provide, such as boot camps, mentoring, pitching, competitions, and access to finance. Now, research also shows that entrepreneurs with a disability in Australia were driven through necessity of poor employment outcomes, together with a passion and desire to give back to the community. So now we're seeing through this report that entrepreneurs with disabilities, no matter what their type, have a commonality of experience that identifies some significant systemic issues. These need to be addressed. These need to be addressed in order to make future entrepreneurial activity easier to achieve for this group of people, but for the benefit of our whole society. And on that note, I'd like to congratulate Simon, Jock, Megan, and all of our industry partners here today and on the project. The National Disability Services Settlement Services International and the Breakthrough People Solutions for their findings and the work on this very important topic. It is clear that this report has provided another piece of the jigsaw puzzle to help better understand authentic understandings of disability self-employment, micro-enterprise, and entrepreneurship, and how important they play in readdressing employment disadvantage and empowering people to forge their own paths through life. Again, not just for their own benefit, but for the benefit of all society. So once again, congratulations everyone, and I look forward to hearing today's discussion. Thank you. I think it's back to you, Simon.
Thanks very much, Attila, for those kind words. And I would also like to acknowledge that diversity and inclusion have been part of UTS's DNA for all but the first few years of my 30-year working life. I say that to make the point that most organisations need to make a conscious decision to change to a more diverse and inclusive organisational culture. Saying words are relatively easy, but making strategic change across all units of an organisation, like a university, is highly complex and nuanced. I can say without any hesitation that UTS had some difficult conversations in those early years, but undertook a strategic change over the history of its 5 disability action and inclusion plans across students, academics, the tower and professional staff from the bottom up and top down. Prior to going to the panel, I will provide just a brief overview of the second report because I understand that some of you may have not been here for the first report as well. So Sarah, could I just get the first slide up, please? Thanks very much. You can go to the next one. So I'd just like, next slide, thanks Sarah. Thanks, just acknowledging the other members of the research team, Professor Jock Collins, who's a real guru around minority entrepreneurship in Australia, and our postdoctoral fellow Megan Stronach, who's done some excellent work in the disability space over a long period of time. I would go to the next slide, thanks. This was a product of an ARC linkage grant that Jock will be saying a little bit more about in a moment, but we can't do this type of research that's deeply engaged with industry without industry partners. So with SSI, Dina will be talking today, but also Ty, Mariana and Violet, the CEO, and we've had a long history of involvement with SSI. National Disability Services, Kerry, Gordon and Paul, and Breakthrough People Solutions, Janice and Ben. If we could go to the next slide, please, Sarah. Report 1 really focused on the lived experience of individuals with disability through qualitative, quantitative and co-design work. Report 2 focuses on at the organisational program level, looking at self-employment programs, micro-enterprise and entrepreneurial programs as they relate to disability. We then have a detailed engagement with the IgniteAbility program, and I will not say any more about that because Dina will be talking about that in a moment. Next slide, please, Sarah. So we took a social ecological approach that looks at the intrapersonal, interpersonal, organisational, community and civic society and public policy macro environments. And today we're commenting on that public policy macro space and the organisational program space. Next slide, thanks, Sarah. And yep, just press the button again. So when we looked at mainstream self-employment, microenterprise and entrepreneurial programs, with the assistance of Murray Herbst from UTS Startups, who identified the 44 mainstream programs for us, only 3 of those programs, or around 7%, had any mentions of inclusion within that program. And that's a major issue around education, but also access to those other part of the entrepreneurial startup world. Next slide. Thanks, Sarah. The report also did an environmental scan of government supports in this space, and many people would have heard of the Disability Employment Services and Australian Disability Enterprises, where a great deal of money goes towards supported disability employment, and they're currently undergoing a major review through the Department of Social Services at the moment, so it's quite timely. Job Access is a program open to individuals who have employment to get reasonable adjustments made and really shatter that stereotype of some employers that disability employment will cost them too much, because those costs can be underwritten to a very high amount. The NDIS, National Disability Insurance Scheme, has a participant employment strategy, and that's been a tremendous inclusion since this research had started. We found a program in Victoria where a voucher system is provided to get entrepreneurs with disability the education they need, and there's also the new enterprise incentive scheme. We also did a scan overseas, and the report contains that information as well. Just the next one, please, Sarah. So when we scoped out the self-employment, microenterprise and entrepreneurial program space, we found a variety of programs, and like all good academics, we like to have some form of way of typing them. And so this continuum, we have called a continuum of self-employment and entrepreneurial programs, starts with general self-employment programs, then micro-enterprise programs that particularly focus on getting a person with a disability, and a lot of those programs relate to people with intellectual disability, into a business that they can run themselves and do so with a good supportive scaffolding around them. And that's done on a one-on-one basis. Then there's the micro-enterprise cohort programs, where people go through that program in a group of people with disability. There's an entrepreneurial program that again is one-on-one. And why these points are so important is that disability is quite diverse. Mobility, vision, hearing, intellectual disability, learning disability, mental health. And depending on the inclusion required, and as Attila noted in his speech, there's much lower levels of employment for people with disability with higher support needs. So those higher support needs sometimes aren't met by mainstream programs. So there are also entrepreneurial cohort programs, and there are entrepreneurial platform online programs with specialist disability inclusions. There's a program that focuses on disability tech business outcomes that has a component of inclusion for people with disability in those teams. And finally, there are the mainstream programs. Next slide, Sarah. Next slide, Sarah. Thanks. So the programs reviewed for this research are on the left-hand side of the page, including IgniteAbility, Remarkable, Challenge Project, Community Living Project, Vanguard Services, Valued Lives, and In Charge. And we also note that there's Disability Leadership Institute has an entrepreneurial program. An online platform program is Chemism, and there's also a new network of for Australian disability entrepreneurs that started up just in the last 9 months. We also acknowledge that the NDIS and Department of Social Services have invested in the self-employment and entrepreneurial space over the last 3 years, and it's unfortunate that COVID's intervened, but those programs also indicate the importance that's being placed on this area. Next slide, Sarah. And so, as noted before, our major case study and working in very close relationship with the wonderful people at IgniteAbility is a main chapter in this document, and identifies the approach taken by Dina and her team. And it is at this point now that I will hand over to Jock to do the introductions of our panelists and also take over for the rest of the seminar. Thanks very much. Jock, microphone. Jock, microphone still. You're on mute, mate.
Sorry about that. I'm a neophyte in terms of being at the University of Technology. I've only been here for 45 years. Apologies for that. Look, thanks, Simon. Thank you all for coming to the launch of this research report. I'd like to thank the Vice-Chancellor for giving up some of his valuable time to open this webinar. And I think the fact that he has given time to, given his very busy schedule, is an indication, pardon me, of the extent to which the university really takes its social role, its social impact in research and teaching very important. As Simon mentioned, pardon me, this project was funded by the Australian Research Council through the Linkage Project Scheme. And I don't know whether you're familiar with this, but what happens is that the ARC gives money and funding to the research, but so too do industry partners who buy into that particular research. The idea is this joint collaboration between the university and the end users of this research is a very important sort of direction of Australian research funding. For this particular research project, as Simon mentioned, our industry partners were Settlement Services International, National Disability Services, and Breakthrough. And I really want to thank these organisations from the bottom of my heart for this commitment. We couldn't have undertaken this research without not only their financial commitment, but they've been involved right from the start. We've met with them regularly. They've helped to shape the whole project, and they've given us access to their networks, their knowledge. They've reviewed our reports. So they've really been partners in the active and real sense all the way through. And once again, thanks very much for that. So what we want to do now at this phase of our project of our presentation about the project is to introduce a few of the industry partners, Dina Petrakis from Settlement Services International and Paul Musso from Ndis, and they'll join Simon Darcy for a discussion of the project, its findings and its policy implications. Now, you've already met Simon, but let me introduce you to Dina and Paul. Dina Petrakis is the Ignite Global Manager of Settlement Services International. She's managed social justice and international aid programs in Australia, the Asia Pacific, including Thailand, Vietnam, Vanuatu, Tonga, and the Solomon Islands. She's worked in the fields of education and training as a research with UWS and in community development. In 2013, which is when I first met Dina, she became the first enterprise facilitator for the Settlement Services International Ignite Small Business Startups program, which then, of course, emerged into IgniteAbility. I'll also introduce Paul before going to them with some questions. So Paul Musso is the Policy Advisor of National Disability Services. He's worked for NDS since 2008 and has over 20 years of experience working in the non-for-profit and public sectors, disability employment policy analysis, and the development of policy solutions has been a key focus of his work since 2008. And in his capacity as a policy advisor at NDS, Paul's responsibilities include formulating policy positions on disability employment, workforce and industrial relations. And Paul has written many of the NDS submissions and policy papers on these topics. He's got a degree in economics from Macquarie University. So as you can see, we have very qualified and experienced industry partners, and you can understand how their participation in the project is such a critical input for Simon and I. So Dina, if I can turn to you first. So, you know, sort of what we've engaged in with you is this IgniteAbility program, a program designed to assist people with disability to set up a business. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, you know, sort of how does the program work? What happens? What's your philosophy?
Thank you, Jock. I'm just going to check that I am on mute. Yes. So IgniteAbility came about from the Ignite program, which we started, as you said, in 2013, and which you evaluated. And we knew we were onto something that worked really well for people who came from vulnerable backgrounds, and our principles of working one-on-one on an ongoing basis. So when the Arc Linkages grant came along, we thought, you know, let's see how Ignite could transfer into the disability space. And so we started together with UTS to look at how a program for entrepreneurs, and I've got to say here that entrepreneurs are risk takers. They are risk takers, and this does not seem to be compatible with most of the disability support services. So we took a risk to say, let's use our principles for entrepreneurship with people living with disability. And again, it worked really well. We don't motivate, we don't initiate, and we don't judge. Decisions are for the entrepreneurs to make, and risks are for the entrepreneurs to take. Of course, all of this being supported by our facilitators. Working with Jock and UTS, we noted early on that we did have to adjust our model to include carers, family and support workers. The pace is also that we found our individual entrepreneurs needed to be managed in a different way as well. So we adjusted the model while all of this action research was happening, and all of this is captured in the report that we're launching today. So for IgniteAbility, the basic premises and the principles of our original Ignite model fit beautifully. It allows people with disability who want to be self-employed, who want to go into the entrepreneurship space, to make the decisions and take the risks. And this is what, again and again, we are finding is really important to them. That's what they're telling us.
Okay, so in a sense, it's my understanding of the program that what you do is you walk the intended entrepreneur from the first step to the last step in the business. You develop what we might call a bespoke pathway for each different one. Can you talk about that, please? Absolutely,
Jock. So the IgniteAbility program uses the services of an IgniteAbility facilitator, which we train. The facilitator works one-on-one with each entrepreneur. Each entrepreneur has their own bespoke journey. So the support that we provide is tailored to each entrepreneur. because we receive entrepreneurs at whatever stage of the business startup they're at. Some of them could just have a business idea. Some of them may already be functioning in a very hobby or micro business kind of way, while others actually come to us with some sort of small business that needs a bit of support to move to the next level. So we accept them at whatever level they are, whatever stage they are in their business development, and we work with them to achieve whatever their goal is. Most of them want to trade, most of them want to expand. So yes, it's a bespoke, tailored journey, and our facilitator works at the pace of each entrepreneur. Our program is free, so the facilitator service is free of charge, it's confidential, and it's ongoing. So the other thing we found that works really well for disability entrepreneurship is you cannot put a time limit on an entrepreneur's business startup. You cannot say, I will support you for 6 months and then you're on your own, or we'll give you a month or a year of support and then you're on your own. So we found that the majority of entrepreneurs require about 12 months of support, although with some of them, because their ideas need scale, we've been with them much longer. What we've also done, Jock, as you know, and Simon as well, is we created now a triage program, which is a small bespoke course where we talk to entrepreneurs to let them know what they're in for if they're really interested in starting a business. Because the business world, particularly in the last 2 years, is very challenging, extremely challenging. And a lot of people who have an idea that they'd like to start a business aren't really aware of what some of the commitment is that they have to provide to this endeavor. So we've created a little 2-day snapshot, challenging course. If you want to start a business, let's talk about it. If you're still interested, we'll put you into the IgniteAbility program to work with a facilitator. Because we have had such a great response from this short information knowledge acquisition course, we are in the process of adapting it through another ILC grant, again with UTS. And what we've done in the adaptation is we have requested the entrepreneurs from the disability program that are mentioned in this report. They are designing, they're co-designing the adaptation of that little course with us, but they're also going to be delivering it alongside us, because we think it's important for people living with disability to be able to see success and to able to see what we call role models, that people have actually done and are doing things that they have only dreamed about. So that's the next iteration. I just wanted to let everybody know that this report doesn't just stop here. It's had legs, it's grown, it's developed, and it's morphing into something really wonderful.
Okay, and what would you say are the particular challenges that people with disability have in setting up a business? Say, comparing the IgniteAbility program to the general Ignite program you've established to assist refugees set up a business.
You spoke about it a little bit earlier, and it is about the ecosystem of support around them that they need. We found that our entrepreneurs living with disability, and regardless of the disability type, need a really connected and really competent support system, and that can sometimes be through carers, support workers, or family members that are just as invested as the entrepreneur within the business. That's the number one challenge. They can't do it alone. Number two, access to finance. It's challenging anyway for our Ignite entrepreneurs, and it's even more challenging for regular lenders, if I can call them regular, lenders to lend even a small loan, because again, they see it as too high risk. So accessing capital is, we found one of a really big obstacle. Testing their product as well, or their service, we find quite challenging sometimes. But, you know, they're entrepreneurs and they overcome the lack of finance. They can overcome lack of the total ecosystem of support around them. They can and I think what I find the biggest challenge that I have seen is that people don't believe they can do it. And that manifests in different ways. It manifests in when we go to test the product, they won't provide, you know, people that we go to, markets, etc., won't provide us with the full spectrum of support, you know, that is required. But they'll say, oh, you know, you can only do it, I'll give it to you for a week and we'll see how we go. And it's like, but you don't say that for any other entrepreneur. Yeah, other entrepreneurs, they pay you $200 and you get a stall. So what does this mean? We'll see how we go. Where did that come from? That kind of response from the general market in Australia, we find to be quite a big challenge. It's how the market sees entrepreneurs living with disability as well.
That's
Thanks very much, Dina.
Jock, I might just pop in there, and for anyone that saw the SBS program the other night on Australia Thinks and saw some of the entrenched attitudes in the general public, the same things exist in an employment sense and certainly in an entrepreneurial sense. For people judging a person not by their ability, but by what they think the constraints of their disability are. And it doesn't matter if you're a young kid coming out of school looking for their first job, or in my case, a professor in a business school. These attitudes come at you all the time. So, you know, that's another little interesting obstacle that, you know, Dina's done a terrific job educating the ecosystem as well as providing tremendous support and scaffolding to the entrepreneurs.
Terrific, thank you. It's a good little segue to my discussion now with Paul. So Paul, I wonder if you could please tell us where NDS sees itself in the self-entrepreneurship, self-employment entrepreneurship landscape, and how that all relates to the disability employment policy issues that your organisation is concerned with.
Thanks very much, Jock. Well, again, this is really a question that goes to, I guess, that emphasis on people with disability being able to exercise choice and control in their life and to pursue their employment goals and, in the case of many entrepreneurs, their dreams. And NDS has encouraged our members, who we have about 200 members that provide open and supported employment services, to consider self-employment as one of a range of employment options that people with disability can access should they choose to do so. Now, these obviously include, I'll just run very briefly through this list. So there's supported employment, which tends to be for people with more severe disability. Transition models to employment for young people who are leaving school and entering the workforce. Mainstream employment, where obviously a person with disability is an employee. Supported open employment, which is where people who might have worked for a disability enterprise work in a mainstream setting. Social enterprises and firms, where the workforce is far more mixed and people with disability might only make up a small proportion of the workforce. But again, there are social enterprises and social firms that run, that take advantage of or have very active roles of people with disability in running those businesses, which is good as well. And then, of course, there's self-employment. And I think the work of Simon and his team has really sort of thankfully given this option a profile. And so one of NDS's most important goals at the moment is to bring the National Disability Insurance Agency along on this journey where this model is increasingly recognised and accessible as an entirely legitimate option for people with disability, and where those entrepreneurs or business people with disability if they need supports to set up and run their business, that they can access those through their NDIS participant plan. So just a brief summary at that point. Thanks, John.
Okay. So just talking, Paul, about the NDIS plan support. So when Simon and I first constructed this research application, the NDIS was just sort of about to come in the next year, and we thought, well, this is a whole change in the policy landscape. I mean, are there or will there be opportunities for sort of entrepreneurship for people with disability in a way that maybe weren't available before? So, I mean, how can the NDIS participants obtain supports in their plans to set up a small business or engage in self-employment at present?
Thanks, Jock. Again, it's a very timely question, because although the NDIS has been around now for about 7 or 8 years, the pricing mechanism for employment supports for NDIS participants has recently changed quite significantly. And so for about a year now, there's been a new or a remodeled employment support for NDIS participants, which is called Supports in Employment. And again, it's meant to emphasise that that principle of choice and control for NDIS participants who are thinking, well, you know, maybe I don't want to work in a disability enterprise, or I don't want to be employed by someone. I've got a vision, I have a particular passion, I'd like to run a business, and I may need some form of support to be able to do that. And supports in employment, in principle, should be able to recognise that. And if the person with disability is an NDIS participant, they should be able to incorporate some element of this supports in employment pricing model into their participant plan to enable them to access particular supports that will assist them to either start up their business or to operate it on an ongoing basis.
So are there any particular policy initiatives you think that could or should be introduced to assist in this transition to entrepreneurship?
Jock, to use a horrible cliche, I think what's really needed at the moment is awareness raising of this option, and that, again, we don't want people with disability to be discouraged from chasing their dreams, running a business, you know, engaging in all sorts of unusual or what might have been, you know, traditionally regarded as employment options or careers that, you know, they might not have been encouraged to pursue, for want of a better term. And again, I don't like to use this term very often, but I think it's all about, again, we need to conquer that tyranny of low expectations. And so where those supports can be provided for people with disability to pursue their dream as an entrepreneur or a business person, then, you know, the NDIS really should be there to facilitate that.
Good. Thank you very much. If I can turn to Simon now, my colleague from the start. Simon, first of all, can I ask you if there are any surprises in the research? So when we discussed this, you know, many years ago, and we sort of, you know, were eventually successful and got underway, has there been anything that sort of surprised you in our research journey and the findings?
That's one of the reasons I've always enjoyed research. There's rarely been a project that I've started off with where I haven't learnt as I've gone, and also been quite shocked at times with how far we haven't come, as well as how far we have come in some areas. I think one of the really, one of the core areas that Dina did some terrific work on is around the risk space, and the risk space in the sense of if somebody's on some form of income support, whether that be, you know, Job Start or the disability support pension, etc., that you have no idea how stifling to innovation government welfare provisions can be. So for somebody to kick off a micro enterprise, become self-employed, or enter the entrepreneurial world, and the reason that I do those differentiations is that for a lot of people with disability, entrepreneurship didn't really resonate because they've been excluded from mainstream programs. So there's a much stronger association with self-employment in that sense, and in some areas micro-enterprise. So Dina was able to, get the person from Centrelink in and, make some really bespoke policy on the go changes that gave those people the flexibility, because we know cash flow can vary radically, and that getting off any form of welfare support is a lot easier than getting back on it. So that was something that is a major outcome in the sense of this research, that this didn't really come up in the fantastic research that's been done in the US. There is note of it in UK-based research, etc. But it's creating an understanding within the welfare bureaucracy that, this is a different space, and these people will have radically different cash flow profiles. And remembering it's not just about the person with disability. If you've got a family, it's also about the family that support's coming through for as well. So I would say the innovation space. And then the second one, and you can have a policy, but as we've seen with the NDIS most recently, unless that policy is communicated throughout the organisation, and I won't go through the whole, value chain with respect to where NDIS has to go, but most people have their plans done by what's called a local area coordinator. A local area coordinator then sends that plan on to a NDIS planner. If you have your plan done by an NDIS planner, that cuts out one of the chains. That's then sent up the line for approval. Now, that means that you need a lot of people really well versed in changes that may have only just occurred. So certainly the people from when Megan and I presented at a conference for the NDS conference in Adelaide on employment, we got commitment from the NDIS representative that yes, people can do this in their plans. But the voices of people with disability kept telling us it might be the policy, but it's certainly not what my local area coordinator or my NDIS person provided. So that, that's one of the outcomes, that a social service safety net is fantastic. But you need it to also be reactive to a new area of employment service that Paul was talking about that may not be well known at this point. So I'll leave it there at the moment.
All right, look, thank you very much. There's heaps more, of course, we could talk about. We've got 15 minutes left, so I think probably at this stage we might want to throw this open for some questions to the audience, if that's possible.
Jock, I've put some questions in the chat for you.
Okay, all right. So we can see that there are some questions in the chat. Let me just. I can't quite. I'm actually on my. Here we go. Sorry. All right. So one question. Michelle Meacham asked, did the research identify the gaps in ordinary entrepreneurship programs that are being fed back to improve access and inclusion rather than specialist disability providers? Simon.
Certainly, and we have been in conversations around that work. But a lot of it is, Michelle, isn't revolutionary as such. It's what we've all known in the education space for a while, particularly around alternative communication. The need, in this case, we're looking at some, if you needed it, there's some live captioning going on today. There's also the accessible nature of the course curriculum. And we know again with education providers that there's a system for that within higher education and secondary education. And the other components to it are that without those being in place, then I've got no doubt that some of the startup community are keen when they're made aware of it, that they need to do these things to include people with disability. But until that's done, people will either not know about the mainstream programs, or there may be an internal resistance until there's a much better understanding of what it requires to provide support for individuals with disability. And again, I would just say that our research with what was called the Startup Muster, which is a mainstream entrepreneurial survey of the startup community in Australia, we were able to get a disability module put into that survey, and what we found was that about 10% of the people surveyed in that program identified as having a disability, but the vast majority of those people had invisible disabilities and weren't people that openly spoke about their disability. So remembering that the different disability types, visible and invisible, and also that a lot of people with disability, with different types of disability, should also, if they're comfortable, speak up about what they need, so that these programs are getting demand so that they can think about changing that up. Certainly one of the most famous of the accelerator programs that I won't name, they had a real basic problem around access and inclusion, in that anyone with any form of mobility disability couldn't even get into the building. And I mean, that's real old style. That's been changed, and we're seeing that real startup community around the Sydney CBD is being invigorated by companies like Google and Microsoft that are doing some real cracker work around inclusion in both a technical sense, but also in the sense of the spaces that they are now using across the major dimensions of disability to get those supports in place for the future.
Thank you. So we've got a second question that starts off by referencing the challenge of connectedness, supporting the business ecosystem. And the question is there already an assessment tool or an app that matches an individual's disability type and soft skills with company or industry partner requirements? For example, for jobs, business, funding, loan, supplier access, that matches that and other business partners with a disability or not. So is there anything like a tool or an app that can assist people in this regard? Simon, or maybe, I don't know whether Dina or Paul have got any knowledge of any sort of, new technology that can assist?
I certainly know that there's a range of new apps that are doing matching in a variety of senses. I haven't seen it in the entrepreneur space at the moment.
Okay.
But it's a great business idea.
Okay. There's a business niche we've identified here. We'll only take 5%. The next question is, what's the effect of COVID-19 had on entrepreneurs with a disability in Australia? Dina, with your IgniteAbility clients, could you maybe talk to that?
Sure. It's had an effect, of course, on everybody. With our disability entrepreneurs, it hasn't had a greater effect than any other of our entrepreneurs at all. In fact, within the disability entrepreneurship space, those entrepreneurs that had consultancies, that were doing workshops for certain disability types actually flourished. We've got a trio of young men at the moment that are doing Dungeons and Dragons for children with autism, and they're just their business is increasing exponentially because they've hit that market where they're working with young kids who are at home from school, and parents can't wait to register their children. We've actually told them to increase their membership price. But I'll leave you with one short story. We found the area that's been hit the most, of course, is retail and hospitality, because they've had to close and just do takeaway. Amongst all our hospitality and retail entrepreneurs, this is across all our programs, the last person to actually need to shut down, and that was quite recently, was a young woman with disability who had a coffee courier business, who's in the report. She was the last one. When many closed last year, she just recently had to shut shop because she wasn't allowed to go out of her area. So we haven't found our entrepreneurs with disability fared any worse at all. Some of them fared better. And in the retail space, across all our programs, it was a young woman with disability that had to close shop just recently.
Good, thank you very much. Now we've got a question for Paul from Gordon Duff, who was very supportive of this research grant in the first instance. So Gordon's question is, Paul, can an NDIS participant use part of their NDIS package to engage in a business incubator type program, whilst also using supports in employments to continue, for example, with open employment or SLES, that is, to combine them?
Yes, thanks, Jock. So my erstwhile colleague, Gordon, that's a fantastic question. And I would like to think yes in the first instance. Now, with supports in employment, there's two sort of elements of that. There's capacity building supports for supports in employment, and then there's supports in employment that relates to sort of ongoing support of a person when they obtain a job. They could certainly maintain their job in a mainstream setting if they were being assisted by a disability employment service. In regard to SLES, I'm not so sure about that. That's a transition program, and it's really designed to assist younger people to gain the skills and experience they need to either be able to then access a disability employment service or to seek open employment, or perhaps then at that point, if they were so inclined, to attempt to commence running a business. So I think supports in employment could almost definitely be used in a capacity sense for accessing that business incubator type program. And that would be where the person with disability was engaged in capacity building for their business or entrepreneurial project. So I hope that's answered your question, Gordon, but I'm happy to also clarify that with our contacts at the agency, if you like.
Thanks very much, Paul. There's the question of which may be a final one, depending how we go for time, and it's really about the scaffolding that's required to support disabled participants in the workforce. And the question is, will these scaffolds be the same into the future, or are they predicted to be different? And I think we can probably extend this to talk about the scaffolding that's required to support entrepreneurs with a disability. You know, what are the scaffold needs, and do we envisage those changing into the future? Simon, did you want to think about that?
I was going to pass to Dina, but look, what we're hoping for is that as people, we've got a much higher level of mainstreaming going through schools. We know that schools programs have become very keen on developing startup and business skills at a much earlier age. We're seeing similar programs running specifically for students with disabilities that have been funded through the ILC program, etc. And one of the really big issues around disability generally is the lack of a multitude of opportunities. For People who are born with a congenital disability, are they getting the same opportunities as the next person in their class to them? And when we talk to people who have gone through some sort of traumatic disability, they may have had a whole heap of experiences with all sorts of work that gives them an idea of what they might like. So the scaffolding around getting work and work-like experiences in either business or just in employment itself is really important, so people can work out what they like to do and not just get a job, but get a career. And so making sure that those experiences are open. But certainly we're starting to see some networks develop. So entrepreneurs with disability are getting that networking opportunity amongst themselves and with mainstream as well. And that's really important because we know the importance of social capital, and a lot of business isn't done during business time. It's done during other social opportunities for either education or fundraising or giving back to the community, etc. So I'll leave my comments there.
Dina, do you have a quick word here?
The scaffolding in terms of our program really comes from our ecosystem of support. Even with Ignite and IgniteAbility, we don't just provide business support. So one of the things that has made our business program, so to speak, unique is that we take a very human-centered approach, so that whatever support the person needs, we will provide regardless of the business. So for Ignite, where we work with refugees and asylum seekers, it's settlement support, because we had people sleeping in cars while they tried to start their businesses. With people who are living with disability, the ecosystem of support includes people who are mental health professionals, people who understand autism, people who can support us, and our entrepreneurs with mobility issues. So we bring all of that to bear for the entrepreneur, because we realize that unless you can support those sorts of challenges, they will never start their business. So we look at a very holistic, individual view of what the needs are for the person, and then what this effect will have on their business needs. So our support is not just a business support, it's a whole of the person support.
Terrific. Look, what wonderful words, Gwen. Look, thank you all very much this time. Thank you all for attending. As Paul said, one of the key issues is to get this information out and about. Where our reports are available, please disseminate them widely. Please let's build some funding and policy support to this area of disability entrepreneurship. And thank you all very much for attending today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. And UTS Disability Entrepreneurship, the report's there and waiting for you now. Thanks very much. Thanks, Dina. Thanks, Paul, for your
Thanks,
involvement.
everyone.
Thank you.